October 1st, 331 BC. 40,000 men stand in formation across a flattened plain in Mesopotamia, and facing them is an army so vast its edges disappear into the horizon, the largest military force ever assembled in human history. Behind that force stands the richest empire on earth, an empire that has ruled for 2 centuries, an empire that controls everything from the Mediterranean to India, an empire that has crushed every rebellion, absorbed every kingdom, and outlasted every challenger. And behind those 40,000 men stands a 25-year-old king who hasn't lost a battle in his life, a king who has already done what everyone said was impossible, a king who is about to do it again. What happens in the next 12 hours will decide who rules the known world, not for a generation, not for a decade, but forever. This is Gaugamela, the day impossibility died, the day the ancient world ended and something new, something unprecedented, was born in blood and dust and absolute conviction. The year is 331 BC, and the place is nowhere, a flat expanse near the village of Gaugamela in what will one day be called Iraq. In a region that has seen empires rise and fall for millennia, there are no mountains here, no forests, no rivers wide enough to matter. Just open ground, deliberately flattened by Persian engineers, stretched under an October sun that bakes the earth into something hard and pale. The air doesn't move, no wind, no relief, just heat radiating off the plain in waves, distorting everything in the distance, making armies shimmer like mirages, making the vast Persian host look even larger than it already is. This is not a place anyone would choose to die, but tens of thousands are about to. The plain itself seems indifferent to what's coming, just dirt and sky and silence, the kind of silence that exists right before the world breaks, open right before history pivots on a single moment. There's a weight to this silence, a pressure in the air, as if the land itself knows what's about to happen, as if the earth is holding its breath, waiting for the first clash of metal, the first scream, the first moment when everything changes forever. His name is Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon, student of Aristotle, king since he was 20. But those are just facts, just words that don't capture what he actually is, what he represents, what he actually is. What he has become in the 3 years since he crossed into Asia is something history has never seen before. Not a conqueror in the traditional sense, not a warlord seeking plunder or territory or revenge, but a force of inevitability. A man who genuinely believes with every fiber of his being, that he is destined to unite the world under a single vision, that he is chosen by the gods, that failure is not just unlikely but literally impossible, not through diplomacy, not through compromise, not through the slow accumulation of power over generations, but through absolute, relentless forward motion, through a kind of momentum that refuses to acknowledge obstacles. He has fought 3 major battles in 3 years and won all of them, crossed from Europe into Asia with an army smaller than most regional forces, and somehow, impossibly, he is winning. His enemies don't just fear him, they cannot understand him because he doesn't fight like everyone else, doesn't preserve his forces for the next campaign, doesn't retreat to regroup when circumstances turn against him, doesn't negotiate truces when victory is uncertain. He attacks, always, in every situation, regardless of odds, regardless of terrain, regardless of conventional military wisdom. And now, on this featureless plain in the heart of the Persian Empire, thousands of miles from his homeland, surrounded by enemies on all sides, facing an army 5 times the size of his own, he's about to do it again, against an empire that has never been defeated on this scale, against the accumulated military might of 2 centuries of Persian dominance, against every rational calculation of probability. To his men, he is more than a king. He is proof that the old rules don't apply anymore, that audacity can triumph over orthodoxy, that one man with absolute conviction can bend the world to his will. They follow him not just because he's their commander, but because he has shown them again and again that victory is possible when you refuse to accept any other outcome. Across from Alexander stands the embodiment of everything he is not a single man, not a single army, but an empire, a civilization, a political structure that has endured longer than most kingdoms have existed. The Achaemenid Empire, the largest political structure humanity has ever built, stretching from the Indus River to the gates of Greece, from the frozen steppes of Central Asia to the burning sands of Egypt, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia. It has existed for 200 years, survived the reigns of great kings and weak ones, crushed rebellions from Egypt to Bactria, absorbed entire kingdoms into its administrative machinery, outlasted every dynasty that challenged it, and its current ruler, Darius III, has just summoned every force it can muster, not from one region, not from one satrapy, but from everywhere, from the furthest corners of an empire so vast that some of its soldiers have been marching for months just to reach this battlefield. Persians from the heartland, the core of imperial power, elite units that have never known defeat. Medes from the Iranian plateau, cavalry so skilled they're considered the best horsemen in the world. Bactrians from the east, warriors from the edge of the known world who fight with a ferocity that terrifies even other Persians. Scythian, cavalry from the steppes, nomads who live on horseback, who can shoot arrows at full gallop, who have never been conquered by any settled civilization. Infantry from Babylon, from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, soldiers fighting to defend their homeland from foreign invasion. Elephants rumored to be brought from India, war beasts that can shatter infantry formations just by their presence. And at the front, gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, 200 scythed chariots, war machines with blades jutting from their wheels designed for one purpose: to shred infantry formations into chaos, to create gaps that cavalry can exploit, to turn the Macedonian phalanx into a mass of broken bodies. This is not an army. This is the world saying no. No to the idea that a Macedonian king can simply walk into Asia and take it. No to the arrogance of youth. No to the notion that military genius can overcome material superiority. No to Alexander. And Darius has made sure the terms are perfect, choosing this battlefield himself specifically because it offers every possible advantage, having it prepared over weeks, leveled by thousands of laborers, cleared of every rock and obstacle, smoothed until it's perfect for his cavalry superiority and his scythed chariots. He's even had his engineers mark out positions, plan deployment zones, create the perfect killing field for Macedonian infantry. Everything is in his favor. The terrain, the numbers, the preparation, the resources, the home field advantage. Everything except one thing. He's fighting Alexander, and Alexander has made a career out of making advantages irrelevant. What happens in the next 12 hours decides more than a battle, more than a campaign, more than even the fate of two armies. It decides whether the Persian Empire, 2 centuries old, impossibly vast, unimaginably wealthy, the greatest power the world has ever known, continues to exist, or whether one man, leading 40,000 soldiers, ends it. There is no middle ground here, no negotiated peace, no tactical retreat, no possibility of a draw, no scenario where both sides walk away to fight another day. If Alexander loses, his army is annihilated this far from home, cut off from resupply, surrounded by hostile territory, with no line of retreat. His invasion ends, his legend dies, the Greek city-states rebel against Macedonian control, and Macedon becomes a footnote in the story of Persian resilience. If Darius loses, his empire collapses, not gradually, not over years of decline, but immediately and catastrophically. His throne disappears, his legitimacy evaporates, his satraps declare independence, his legacy becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when old power meets new ambition. One of these men will walk off this field as the ruler of the known world, master of the largest empire in history, and the other will be running for his life, abandoned by his own men, hunted by his enemies, facing execution or exile. The clock is already ticking, the armies are already in position, the commanders have already made their plans, and there is no way out except through. This is total war, the kind of conflict where everything is at stake, where losing means extinction, where the consequences will echo through centuries. But how did it come to this? How does a 25-year-old from a secondary kingdom in the Balkans end up threatening the greatest empire on earth, standing on a Mesopotamian plain, about to decide the fate of continents? The answer begins before Alexander was even born, in the 350s BC, when Macedon was a backwater, a rough, mountainous kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, tribal, disorganized, militarily irrelevant, considered barely Greek by the sophisticated city-states to the south. But Alexander's father, Philip II, changed that. Philip didn't just reform Macedon, didn't just modernize its military, didn't just expand its territory. He reinvented warfare itself, creating the Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers wielding 18-foot pikes called sarissas, trained to move as a single, impenetrable block, a wall of spear points that could hold against any cavalry charge. He professionalized the army, implementing full-time soldiers rather than seasonal militias, constant drilling rather than occasional training, discipline that had never been seen in Greek warfare. He combined the phalanx with mobile cavalry units, with light infantry that could operate independently, with siege engineers who could take any city, creating a combined arms force that could adapt to any tactical situation. And then he conquered Greece, not through brute force alone, but through strategy, diplomacy, intimidation, and when necessary, overwhelming tactical brilliance. He played Greek city-states against each other, funded anti-Athenian factions, married strategically, bribed officials, and when diplomacy failed, crushed opposition with military precision. By the time Philip died in 336 BC, Macedon was the dominant power in Greece, the hegemon of a military alliance that included every major Greek state, and Philip had one final ambition: invade Persia, revenge the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier, liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor, plunder the richest empire on earth. But he never got the chance. He was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, stabbed by his own bodyguard Pausanias, in a conspiracy that has never been fully explained, and the empire-building project seemed dead, the momentum lost, the grand invasion cancelled before it began. Until his son took the throne. Alexander was 20 years old when he became king, and many thought he'd be a placeholder, a young ruler who would consolidate his father's conquests, but lacked the vision to expand them. The Greek city-states thought Macedonian dominance would end, that they could rebel and restore their independence. The northern tribes thought they could raid Macedon with impunity. Darius thought the threat of invasion had died with Philip. They all underestimated him catastrophically, failed to recognize that Philip had created the weapon, but Alexander would wield it with a genius his father never possessed. Within 2 years, Alexander had crushed rebellions in Thrace and Illyria, marched an army to Thebes when they revolted, and when they refused to surrender, he burned the city to the ground, killed or enslaved the entire population, left nothing but temples standing as a warning to the other Greek cities. This is what happens when you challenge Macedonian power. He secured his northern borders, consolidated control over Greece, assembled the invasion force his father had planned, and in 334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia with 35,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was a small force by Persian standards, barely a regional army, but it was the most professional, most disciplined, most tactically innovative force in the ancient world, and Alexander led them into the heart of the Persian Empire with absolute confidence that he would never turn back. For the Persians, Alexander's invasion was not just an attack, it was an insult, a reversal of the natural order of things, a violation of how the world was supposed to work, because for 2 centuries, Persia had been the one expanding. Persia had been the aggressor. Persia had invaded Greece twice under Darius I and Xerxes, had burned Athens to the ground, had dictated terms to Greek city-states, bought their politicians, funded their wars against each other, treated Greece as a frontier region to be managed, not a threat to be feared. Greece was a source of mercenaries, a collection of quarrelsome city-states that fought each other more than they fought Persia, a peripheral concern for an empire focused on the east. And now a Macedonian, barely even Greek by Persian standards, certainly not from one of the great city-states like Athens or Sparta, was marching through their empire, winning battles, taking cities, humiliating their commanders, treating Persian power with contempt. After Alexander's first victory at the Granicus River in 334 BC, the Persians were annoyed. A regional satrap's force had been defeated, but these things happened. Border skirmishes were common. It didn't mean anything. After the second, at Issus in 333 BC, where Darius himself took command of a large army and still lost, where Darius fled the battlefield leaving his family behind, they were humiliated. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters were captured and treated with respect by Alexander. But the message was clear. The great king had abandoned his own family to save himself, had run from a Macedonian king barely old enough to grow a full beard, had proven that Persian power was hollow, and Alexander didn't just win, he kept moving, taking the entire eastern Mediterranean coast city by city, siege by siege, cutting off Persian access to the sea, destroying their naval bases, eliminating their ability to threaten Greece or Macedon. He besieged Tyre for 7 months, building a causeway to reach the island city, taking what was supposed to be impregnable. He conquered Gaza, executed its commander, marched into Egypt where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule, was crowned pharaoh, founded a city, Alexandria, that would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, outlasting both the Macedonian and Persian empires. And all the while, Darius was watching his empire disintegrate piece by piece, watching his generals fail, watching his credibility erode with every lost battle, every surrendered city, every week that Alexander remained alive and undefeated. For Darius, Gaugamela wasn't about strategy, wasn't about territorial control, wasn't about resources. It was about survival, not just his own survival as king, but the survival of an idea, the idea that Persia was eternal, unchallengeable, divinely ordained to rule the world. If he lost again, if he fled another battlefield, if Alexander continued his march eastward, there would be no coming back, no rallying the empire, no restoring faith in Persian power. His satraps would rebel, his subject peoples would declare independence, his empire would fragment into a dozen successor states. So he didn't just gather an army, he gathered everything, calling in every favor from every corner of the empire, mobilizing forces that hadn't seen combat in generations, assembling a coalition so vast it would make resistance impossible, victory inevitable, the invasion over. And the result was the largest coalition force ever assembled in the ancient world. Conservative modern estimates put Darius's army at somewhere between 100,000 to 200,000 men, while ancient sources claim even more, numbers so vast they seemed mythological, exaggerated, impossible. But even the conservative estimate is staggering, almost incomprehensible in its scale, because Alexander brought 40,000. That's a 5-to-1 disadvantage at minimum, possibly worse, possibly as much as 8 or 10 to 1, if the higher estimates are accurate. And this time, Darius wasn't reacting, wasn't responding to Alexander's moves, wasn't fighting on ground. Alexander chose. He was dictating terms. He chose the battlefield near Gaugamela, specifically because it was perfect for his strategy, wide and flat and open, ideal for his cavalry superiority and his scythed chariots, with no forests where infantry could take cover, no rivers that could protect flanks, no hills that could anchor defensive positions. He even had his engineers spend weeks preparing the ground, smoothing it, removing every rock and obstacle that might impede his chariots, creating the perfect killing field for Macedonian infantry. He deployed his forces carefully, cavalry on both flanks to envelop and crush, infantry in the center to hold, chariots at the front to break the Macedonian formation, elephants in reserve to exploit any breakthrough. This wasn't just another battle, this was the empire's final answer, the culmination of 2 years of preparation, the moment when superior numbers, superior resources, and superior position would finally crush this upstart Macedonian king who had gotten lucky twice. And if you were a soldier in Alexander's army, marching toward Gaugamela, staring across that plain at a force so large you couldn't see its edges, at chariots with blades that could tear a man apart, at cavalry units that had been fighting for generations, at infantry formations that stretched beyond the horizon. You'd have every reason to believe this was the end, that you were marching to your death, that not even Alexander could overcome these odds. The night before Gaugamela, the Persian army stayed awake. Darius, paranoid about a night attack, remembering how Alexander had used unconventional tactics before, ordered his men to remain in formation, and torches burned across the plain as soldiers stood at attention for hours, exhaustion creeping in before the battle even began. It was a catastrophic decision, born of fear rather than strategic thinking, because standing in armor for 12 hours drains men just as much as marching, maybe more, because there's no movement to keep blood flowing, just standing, waiting, muscles cramping, minds wandering to thoughts of home and family and all the things they might never see again. Meanwhile, in the Macedonian camp, Alexander slept deeply, so deeply that his generals had to wake him the next morning, had to shake him multiple times before he opened his eyes. One of them, Parmenion, the old general who had served Alexander's father, who had won battles when Alexander was still a child, asked him how he could possibly sleep before the most important battle of his life, before a fight that would decide everything. And Alexander's response has echoed through history, been quoted by generals and leaders for 2 millennia. Why shouldn't I sleep? The enemy has already done what I wanted. They're all in one place. It sounds like arrogance, like the kind of theatrical confidence leaders use to calm their men, like bravado designed to project invincibility. But it wasn't. It was calculation, cold strategic assessment. Because Alexander knew something Darius didn't, understood something about large armies that the Persian king had failed to grasp. Large armies are hard to control, they're slow, they're rigid, they depend on formation integrity and clear lines of communication between commanders and units. And if you can break that integrity, if you can create chaos in one part of the line, if you can disrupt command and control, the size advantage becomes a liability, with soldiers trampling each other trying to maneuver, units losing cohesion and fragmenting, commanders unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Alexander wasn't intimidated by the size of Darius's force. He was going to use it against him, turn the empire's greatest strength into its fatal weakness, create chaos that would spread like wildfire through the massive army until it consumed everything. October 1st, 331 BC, dawn breaks over Gaugamela, and the armies face each other across the flattened plain. On the Persian side, a formation so wide it curves at the edges, so deep in places that rear units can't even see the enemy, designed to wrap around and encircle the Macedonians, to surround them completely and crush them from all sides. And on the Macedonian side, a tighter, more compact formation, angled slightly to the right, refusing the traditional parallel deployment, creating angles that confuse Persian commanders trying to match their deployment. Darius gives the order, and the scythed chariots roll forward. 200 bladed machines that have been deployed successfully in previous battles, that the Persians believe will tear through the Macedonian phalanx like knives through cloth. They're designed to create panic, to make infantry break formation and run, to open gaps that cavalry can exploit. They accelerate across the prepared ground, wheels spinning faster and faster, blades flashing in the morning sun, and the Persian army watches, expecting to see the Macedonian line dissolve, expecting chaos and screaming and the beginning of a rout. But the Macedonian infantry does something unexpected, something they've clearly trained for, something that shows the difference between Alexander's army and every other force in the ancient world. They don't hold formation, don't brace for impact, don't try to stop the chariots head-on. They open gaps, creating corridors between units, passages just wide enough for the chariots to race through. It's a maneuver that requires extraordinary discipline, because every instinct tells you to close ranks when cavalry approaches, to make your formation tighter, stronger, more defensible. But the Macedonians do the opposite, and the chariots race through the gaps and hit nothing, most passing harmlessly through the openings and continuing past the Macedonian rear, useless and impotent. And the ones that don't make it through the gaps, the ones that swerve or slow or try to target specific units, are swarmed by light infantry with javelins and spears, Agrianians and Thracians who have been specifically deployed for this purpose, who grab reins and drag drivers from their horses and kill them. Within minutes, the scythed chariot attack, the centerpiece of Darius's plan, the weapon he spent months preparing the battlefield for, the tactical innovation that was supposed to win the battle before it even truly began, has failed completely, utterly, without inflicting meaningful casualties. But the real battle is just beginning, because now the Persian cavalry is moving, tens of thousands of horsemen on both flanks. Some of the best in the world, veterans of dozens of campaigns, and they're crashing into the Macedonian flanks like a hammer striking an anvil. The Persian cavalry hits the Macedonian left flank with tremendous force. And these aren't light skirmishers, aren't raiders or scouts. These are armored shock cavalry, cataphracts in some cases, wearing scale armor, riding armored horses, wielding long lances, veterans who have fought in campaigns from Egypt to Bactria. And they're trying to do exactly what Darius planned, what every tactical manual recommends when you have numerical superiority. Envelop Alexander's line, get around his flanks, cut him off from retreat, destroy him from the sides, where the phalanx is vulnerable. On the Macedonian left, the general Parmenion is holding the line, but barely, and the fighting is brutal, close-quarters chaos that has nothing to do with tactics or formation, just violence and survival. Shields splintering under the impact of lances, horses screaming as they go down, men crushed underfoot in the press of bodies, dust rising in clouds that make it impossible to see more than a few feet. Parmenion, at 65 years old, the most experienced general in Alexander's army, sends a message to Alexander: "We need help. We're being overwhelmed. The Persian cavalry is too strong. Send reinforcements or this flank collapses and we're all dead." It's not panic, not exaggeration. It's cold assessment of the tactical situation. But Alexander doesn't send help, doesn't dispatch reserves, doesn't do what conventional military wisdom demands, because he's seen something else. Something Darius hasn't noticed yet, something that makes reinforcing the left flank irrelevant. In the center of the Persian line, as their cavalry extends further and further to the flanks, trying to surround the Macedonians, trying to execute the envelopment that should guarantee victory, a gap has formed. It's not large, maybe not even intentional, possibly just the natural result of units moving at different speeds, of cavalry outpacing infantry, of a line so long that maintaining cohesion is impossible. But it's there, a weakness. In the center, a space between units, a crack in the formation that shouldn't exist in a well-commanded army. And Alexander has been waiting for exactly this moment, has been watching for it, has built his entire battle plan around forcing it to happen. Alexander doesn't hesitate, doesn't call a council of war, doesn't send scouts to verify the gap exists. He takes his companion cavalry, the elite mounted unit he personally commands, 2,000 of the best horsemen in his army, men who have followed him since he crossed into Asia, who have charged with him at the Granicus and Issus, who trust him absolutely, and forms them into a wedge, a spearhead formation designed for one purpose: penetration. And he charges, not at the Persian flanks where the fighting is heaviest, not at their cavalry where they're strongest, not at any of the positions where military doctrine says you should attack, but straight at the gap in their center, straight at the point where the formation is weakest, straight at Darius himself. It's insane by conventional standards. The Persian army still outnumbers him 5-1. He's leaving Parmenion to fight alone on the left with no support. He's gambling everything on a single thrust into the heart of the enemy formation, betting his life and his army and his entire campaign on the assumption that he can reach Darius before the Persian reserves can respond. But Alexander isn't trying to win by attrition, isn't trying to grind down the enemy through superior tactics or endurance. He's trying to win by decapitation, by killing the head and watching the body die. If he can kill or capture Darius, if he can shatter the command structure, if he can create panic in the Persian center, the battle ends regardless of what's happening on the flanks, regardless of whether Parmenion is winning or losing, regardless of the numerical odds. The companions smash through the Persian center like a hammer through glass, moving so fast the Persian infantry can't reform, can't respond, can't even understand what's happening because they were expecting to fight the Macedonian phalanx, not elite cavalry appearing from an unexpected angle. They're cutting through unit after unit, leaving chaos in their wake. And in the dust and blood and confusion, through the press of bodies and the clash of weapons, Darius sees them coming, sees Alexander at the head of the wedge, close enough to recognize, close enough to kill. Darius is in a chariot, standing elevated above the battlefield, so he can see and be seen, surrounded by his royal guard, the immortals, 10,000 of the best troops in the Persian army, men who have sworn to die before allowing harm to reach their king. And suddenly, Alexander is there, not at a distance where you can give orders to deal with him, not across the battlefield where you can maneuver to counter him, but close, dangerously close, close enough that Darius can see his face, can see the blood on his armor from men he's already killed, can see the absolute certainty in his eyes, the complete absence of doubt or fear. And for the second time in his life, Darius III, King of Kings, Shahanshah, ruler of the largest empire on earth, descendant of Cyrus the Great who conquered Babylon and Lydia and Media, heir to Xerxes who invaded Greece with 1 million men, runs. He turns his chariot, shouts at his driver, abandons his position at the center of his army, and flees the battlefield at full speed. And the moment he does, everything changes. Because if the king runs, if the great king, the living embodiment of Persian power, the man chosen by Ahura Mazda to rule the world, if he abandons the field of battle, what are you fighting for? What's the point of holding your position, of maintaining formation, of dying for an empire whose king won't die for it? The collapse isn't gradual, isn't a slow erosion of morale, isn't units retreating in good order. It's immediate and catastrophic. Units that were holding their ground moments ago, that were fighting effectively, that were winning their individual engagements, suddenly break, soldiers dropping their weapons and running, officers trying to rally their men and failing because there's nothing to rally around anymore. No king to fight for, no empire to defend, just the immediate necessity of survival. The Persian left, which had been pushing hard against Parmenion, which had been on the verge of breaking through the Macedonian line, which had been executing their part of the battle plan perfectly, suddenly gets word that the king has fled, that the center has collapsed, that there's no longer a coherent battle to fight. And they falter, not immediately, because good troops don't break just because of rumors. But when they look toward the center and see the chaos, see units scattering in all directions, see Alexander's cavalry cutting through the heart of their army, they understand that the battle is lost, and they break, abandoning their attack on Parmenion, turning to flee, creating a cascade effect as units that were holding only because everyone around them was holding suddenly find themselves alone and exposed. The Persian right, which had been trying to envelop the Macedonian left, which had actually achieved some success in getting around the flank, realizes the center is gone, and they're surrounded now, caught between the Macedonian phalanx reforming to face them and Alexander's cavalry that could turn at any moment and destroy them. And they scatter, every man for himself, discipline evaporating in the face of existential threat. And then the cavalry, the elite units that had been winning on the flanks, the horsemen who had spent the entire battle executing their orders perfectly, who had been doing everything right. They see the collapse and understand that staying means death or capture, that there's no army left to support, no battle left to win. They run too, turning their horses and fleeing in whatever direction seems safest. It's not a retreat, not an organized withdrawal where units maintain cohesion and fall back in good order. It's a disintegration, a complete breakdown of military cohesion, an army of perhaps 200,000 men dissolving into a mob of individuals trying desperately to escape. Within an hour, the largest army ever assembled in the ancient world is fleeing in every direction, some units still fighting, isolated pockets of resistance trying to cover the retreat, or dying where they stand because they value honor more than survival, but most just running, throwing down shields and spears because the weight slows them down, abandoning formation because formation doesn't matter when there's no one to form with, desperate to escape before Alexander's cavalry reaches them. And Alexander's cavalry pursues, not for minutes or hours but for miles, cutting down anyone too slow to escape, turning a military defeat into a massacre, killing men who have thrown down their weapons and are trying to surrender because in the chaos and bloodlust, there's no way to tell who's surrendering and who's regrouping, and Alexander wants to make sure this army never reforms, never threatens him again, never gives Darius another chance to rebuild. By the time the sun sets on Gaugamela, the plain is silent in a way that has nothing to do with peace and everything to do with death. The largest battle in ancient history is over, decided in less than 12 hours, and the field is covered in bodies as far as you can see, tens of thousands dead, Persians mostly, but Macedonians too, because no victory is free, no matter how decisive, no matter how one-sided the final result appears. Parmenian's flank held, but barely, and if you walk through his lines you see the cost, men with wounds that will kill them. Slowly, others missing limbs, veterans who have fought in a dozen battles sitting in shock because they've never seen violence like this. The Persian cavalry that hit the left flank fought with desperate ferocity, with the courage of men who knew they were defending their homeland, their families, their entire way of life, and they died well even as they died uselessly. If the Persian cavalry had broken through Parmenion's line, if Darius had stood his ground for even a few more minutes, if any of a dozen small decisions had gone differently, the outcome could have been reversed, could have been Alexander's army scattering across the plain, could have been the Macedonian king's head sent to Persepolis as proof that the invasion was over. But they didn't, and now, as Alexander walks through the aftermath, past the dead and the dying, past abandoned chariots and broken weapons, past horses with arrows in their flanks and men calling for water they'll never receive. He knows what this means. Darius is still alive, still technically the king, still has other armies in other parts of the empire he could theoretically rally, but he's no longer a ruler. He's a fugitive, a man running for his life, a king without an army, and the Persian Empire no longer has a center, no longer has legitimacy in the eyes of its subjects, no longer has the capacity to resist. The battle that was supposed to stop Alexander, that was supposed to be the empire's final answer, that was supposed to prove that numbers and resources and preparation matter more than individual genius, has instead destroyed the last credible military force the empire could field, has broken Persian power so completely that what comes next isn't conquest, it's occupation. It's the slow process of accepting a new reality. After Gaugamela, Alexander didn't stop, didn't pause to consolidate his victory, didn't give the Persians time to regroup or rally around a new king or organize resistance. He marched to Babylon, the greatest city in the east, expecting a siege, expecting resistance, and the gates opened without a fight, the citizens lining the streets to welcome him, not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, throwing flowers and singing hymns, because to them he wasn't destroying the world, he was ending a war that had brought nothing but suffering. He marched to Susa and claimed the imperial treasury, untold wealth accumulated over centuries of conquest and taxation, enough gold and silver to fund a dozen more campaigns, to pay his army for years, to build cities and monuments and temples. The ancient sources claim he found 50,000 talents of gold, an amount so vast it's almost meaningless, enough wealth to remake the economy of the entire Mediterranean. He marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the symbol of everything the Achaemenids had built, the city where Darius and Xerxes had received tribute from conquered peoples, where the wealth of the empire was displayed in architecture and art, and he burned it. Not in rage, not as random destruction, not because his men got drunk and started a fire, but deliberately, systematically, as a message that the old world was over, that Persian dominance had ended, that there would be no going back. Some sources say Alexander regretted it later, called it the worst decision of his life, but in the moment it was calculated, a symbolic act designed to tell every Persian satrap, every subject people, every city in the empire, the Achaemenids are finished. Darius fled east, trying to rally support, trying to gather forces for one more stand, sending messages to his satraps demanding they bring their armies, promising rewards for loyalty, threatening punishment for betrayal. But his own satraps killed him, stabbed him, and left him dying on the side of a road, not because they hated him, not because they were particularly loyal to Alexander, but because he had become irrelevant, because Alexander was already the de facto ruler, and resistance was suicide, because backing a fugitive king meant their own destruction. And Alexander kept moving to Afghanistan, to Central Asia, to the edge of the known world, fighting for 8 more years in campaigns that make Gaugamela look simple. He conquered Bactria and Sogdiana, regions so remote most Greeks didn't know they existed. He crossed the Hindu Kush in winter, something military experts said was impossible. He fought in India, won battles against elephants and monsoons, reached the Ganges before his army finally mutinied and forced him to turn back, not because they'd been defeated, but because they were exhausted, traumatized, desperate to go home. He would die at 32 in Babylon, in the palace of the Persian kings he'd destroyed, never having lost a battle, never having stopped moving forward, never having doubted that the world could be remade according to his vision. But it all began at Gaugamela, on a flattened plain in Mesopotamia, on October 1st, 331 BC, the day a 25-year-old Macedonian king destroyed the greatest empire on earth, not through superior numbers, not through better resources, not through technological advantage, but through audacity, through speed, through tactical genius, through the unshakable belief that the impossible was just another obstacle. After Gaugamela, the world belonged to Alexander, and it would never be the same again, because on that day, the age of empires shifted, the East fell, the West rose, Greek culture began its spread across Asia that would last for centuries, and one man stood at the center of it all, having rewritten the rules of history in a single afternoon, having proved that conviction and genius could overcome any material disadvantage, having shown that the world belonged not to those with the largest armies, but to those with the courage to use what they had without hesitation or doubt. This was Gaugamela, the battle that changed everything, the day the ancient world ended and the Hellenistic age began, the moment when one man's vision became reality through nothing but absolute, relentless will.